In the early 1970s, something fundamental broke in the American spirit. The optimism of the 1960s had curdled into the harsh realities of the Vietnam War, political corruption, and skyrocketing crime rates. The traditional movie hero, the square-jawed sheriff with a shiny badge who always played by the rules, no longer made sense to audiences. When the system feels broken, people stop looking for policemen. They start looking for vigilantes. This cultural shift birthed a very specific kind of cinema. It was the era of the anti-hero, the lone wolf pushed too far, the man who realized that sometimes, to do the right thing, you have to do something very wrong. If you found yourself captivated by the rural justice, the anti-establishment ethos, and the stoic violence of Tom Laughlin's Billy Jack, then you have only scratched the surface of what the 1970s had to offer. To truly understand the psychology of people who flock to these theaters, you have to look at the cinematic vigilantes who define the decade. These are the 13 essential 1970s vigilante movies you must watch if you loved Billy Jack. Number 1. Walking Tall. We start where the rural vigilante genre truly caught fire, Walking Tall from 1973. If Billy Jack was the counterculture myth, Walking Tall was the Southern fried reality. Based loosely on the true story of Sheriff Buford Pusser, the film stars Joe Don Baker as a former wrestler who returns to his Tennessee hometown only to find it entirely corrupted by illegal gambling, prostitution, and a criminal syndicate that operates with complete impunity. When the law fails to protect him and in fact turns against him, Pusser doesn't just give up. He carves himself a massive wooden club and goes to war. What makes Walking Tall so incredibly compelling is its raw, unpolished brutality. There is no slick martial arts choreography here. When Pusser swings that stick, you feel the sheer, desperate rage of a man who has decided that the only way to clean up a dirty town is to get his own hands filthy. It perfectly taps into that same primal satisfaction Billy Jack delivered. The visceral joy of seeing corrupt, untouchable bullies finally get what's coming to them. Number 2. Mr. Majestike. That theme of the reluctant warrior pushed to the absolute breaking point is perfected in our next film, Mr. Majestike, released in 1974. Starring the legendary Charles Bronson, this movie takes a completely bizarre premise and turns it into a masterclass of tension. Bronson plays Vince Majestike, a quiet, unassuming watermelon farmer in rural Colorado. He's also a decorated Vietnam veteran, much like Billy Jack's Green Beret background. Majestike just wants to harvest his crop in peace, but he soon finds himself caught between a sleazy, local extortionist trying to force him to hire unskilled labor and a ruthless mafia hitman played with terrifying intensity by Al Lettieri. What makes Mr. Majestike so brilliant is that Bronson's character is fiercely dedicated to not getting involved. He actively tries to avoid the action, but when the mobsters make the fatal mistake of destroying his watermelon crop, the switch flips. The second half of the film is a masterfully paced game of cat and mouse in the mountains, culminating in a spectacular, dust-choked car chase featuring classic 70s muscle and a Ford F-100 that takes a beating. It's a grounded, gritty story of a man defending his livelihood against the mob, written with sharp, crackling dialogue by the great Elmore Leonard. Number 3. Rolling Thunder. If you want a film that takes the Vietnam veteran trope and pushes it into absolute darkness, you must watch Rolling Thunder from 1977. Directed by John Flynn and co-written by Paul Schrader, whom we will discuss later, this is a revenge film stripped of all glamour. William Devane plays Major Charles Rain, a man who returns home after spending 7 years in a horrific POW camp in Hanoi. He is celebrated as a hero, but inside, he is completely dead. When a gang of local thugs invades his home to steal the silver coins he was gifted by the town, they torture him by grinding his hand in a garbage disposal and murder his family. Rain doesn't cry. He doesn't scream. He simply files his new prosthetic hook into a razor-sharp weapon, calls up his old war buddy, played by a young Tommy Lee Jones, and goes hunting. Rolling Thunder is a profoundly disturbing look at trauma. These men don't seek revenge out of passion. They do it because war is the only thing they understand anymore. It is cold, methodical, and builds to a climax in a Mexican brothel that is one of the most intense, unrelenting shootouts of the decade. Number 4. High Plains Drifter. While some vigilantes were shaped by the jungles of Vietnam, others were born from the dust of the Old West. Clint Eastwood directed and starred in High Plains Drifter in 1973, taking the classic Western hero and twisting him into something supernatural and terrifying. Eastwood plays a nameless stranger who rides into the corrupt, cowardly mining town of Lago. The townsfolk, terrified of 3 outlaws who are coming to burn the town down, hire the stranger to protect them. But the stranger isn't a noble protector. He is a cruel, mocking avenger who forces the town to literally paint all their buildings blood red and renames the town Hell. The film heavily implies that the stranger is actually a ghost, the reincarnated spirit of the town's former sheriff, whom the cowardly citizens watched get whipped to death. It takes the vigilante concept and turns it into a story of divine, inescapable retribution. The townsfolk are just as guilty as the outlaws, and the stranger makes sure everyone pays the price. Number 5. The Outlaw Josie Wales. Eastwood continued to deconstruct the Western mythos with The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976. This film perfectly bridges the gap between the traditional Western and the cynical 1970s revenge thriller. Wales is a peaceful Missouri farmer whose family is slaughtered by pro-Union Jayhawkers during the Civil War. He joins Confederate bushwhackers to exact his revenge, but when the war ends and his comrades surrender only to be massacred, Wales refuses to yield. He becomes a fugitive, a one-man army carving a bloody path across the frontier. Like Billy Jack, Josie Wales is a man who just wants to be left alone, but is constantly forced into violence by a corrupt and hypocritical system. He gathers a makeshift family of outcasts along the way, proving that while he is a killer, he hasn't lost his humanity. It is a sprawling, violent epic that questions the very nature of government authority and the morality of war. Number 6. White Lightning. Moving from the horses of the Old West to the roaring V8 engines of the Deep South, we have White Lightning, released in 1973. Starring Burt Reynolds at the absolute peak of his charm, the film follows Gator McCluskey, a moonshiner serving time in an Arkansas prison. When he learns that his younger brother was murdered by a deeply corrupt, violently oppressive local sheriff named J.C., Connors, Gator, strikes a deal with the feds to go undercover and dismantle the sheriff's operation. White Lightning is steeped in the hicksploitation genre, full of high-speed car chases on dirt roads, jumping classic cars over swamps, and sticking it to the local law. But beneath the roaring engines and Reynolds' signature smirk is a surprisingly dark story of abuse of power. Sheriff Connors represents the ultimate corrupt authority figure, a man who uses his badge to run the county like his own personal kingdom. Gator's crusade against him is less about upholding the law and entirely about settling a blood debt. Number 7. Jackson County Jail. The theme of innocent people fleeing corrupt Southern law enforcement is pushed to the extreme in Jackson County Jail from 1976. Yvette Mimieux stars as Dinah, an advertising executive who leaves Los Angeles for a cross-country road trip, only to be robbed, beaten, and eventually thrown into a filthy rural jail by a corrupt police officer who sexually assaults her. In an act of pure survival and vengeance, she murders the cop and escapes alongside a fellow inmate, a hardened criminal played by Tommy Lee Jones. The film is a harrowing, claustrophobic nightmare about how quickly the veneer of civilized society can vanish when you cross the wrong county line. It shares Billy Jack's deep mistrust of local authorities and paints a picture of an America where the police are often far more dangerous than the criminals. Dinah's transformation from a comfortable city woman to a desperate, hardened fugitive is a fascinating psychological journey. Number 8. Macon County Line. A similar tragic fate befalls the characters in Macon County Line from 1974. Set in the 1950s but dripping with 1970s cynicism, this film tells the story of two brothers joyriding through the South before they are set to enlist in the military. Their car breaks down in a small Georgia town ruled by a tough, uncompromising local sheriff. Through a series of horrific misunderstandings involving a pair of drifters who commit a brutal murder, the innocent brothers become the targets of a massive, heavily armed vigilante manhunt led by the grieving sheriff. What makes Macon County Line so devastating is that it shows the dark side of vigilantism. When the law takes matters into its own hands out of grief and rage, innocent people die. It is a bleak, uncompromising film that subverts the triumphant revenge narrative, leaving the audience with a profound sense of emptiness and tragedy. Number 9. Vigilante Force. If you want to see a small town tear itself apart through vigilantism, Vigilante Force from 1976 is essential viewing. Jan Michael Vincent stars as a young man living in an economically depressed California oil town that has been completely overrun by roughnecks and criminals. The local police are powerless, so he calls in his older brother, a battle-hardened Vietnam veteran played by Chris Christopherson, to clean up the town. Christopherson brings in a heavily armed crew of his fellow veterans, and initially they are hailed as heroes. But the film takes a brilliant dark turn. Once the veterans eliminate the criminals, they realize they are now the most powerful force in town, and they simply take over the criminal enterprise themselves. It's a brilliant commentary on the dangers of mercenary justice. When you hire monsters to kill the wolves, you are left with the monsters. The climactic battle, which essentially turns the small town into a Vietnam-style war zone, is a masterclass in chaotic 1970s action cinema. Number 10. Straw Dogs. For a more intimate, psychological study of violence, we must look at Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs from 1971. Dustin Hoffman plays David Sumner, a timid, intellectual American mathematician who moves to an isolated village in rural England with his British wife. The local men, whom David hires to repair his barn, mock his passivity, openly harass his wife, and eventually escalate their torment to horrific violence. David is a pacifist who believes he is above primal confrontation, but when the men lay siege to his home, David is forced to defend his property. Straw Dogs is incredibly controversial and deeply uncomfortable to watch. It asks a terrifying psychological question. What does it take to turn a civilized, educated man into a savage killer? The final 30 minutes of the film are a masterwork of escalating tension, as David uses bear traps, boiling oil, and shotguns to butcher his attackers. It is vigilantism born not of nobility, but of sheer, terrifying survival instinct. Number 11. Dirty Harry. While rural films dominated the genre, the urban vigilante was equally important, and no character defined that archetype better than Clint Eastwood's Inspector Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry, 1971. Technically, Harry is a cop, but he operates with the mentality of a pure vigilante. Set in a San Francisco gripped by fear of a Zodiac-style serial killer named Scorpio, the film constantly highlights the failures of the bureaucratic justice system. Harry catches the killer, but because he didn't follow proper search and seizure protocols, the killer is let go. The film argues that in an increasingly violent and chaotic world, the rules meant to protect the innocent are only protecting the guilty. Harry is the ultimate anti-establishment figure with a badge. He hates his bosses, he hates politicians, and he is perfectly willing to use his .44 Magnum to exact justice the courts are too cowardly to deliver. It is a landmark film that sparked fierce debates about police brutality and fascism, tapping directly into the boiling frustrations of the American public. Number 12. Death Wish. That same frustration reached a fever pitch with the release of Death Wish in 1974. If Billy Jack was a fantasy of righteous, targeted justice, Death Wish was a nightmare of random urban decay. Charles Bronson stars as Paul Kersey, a bleeding heart, liberal architect living in New York City. When his wife is brutally murdered and his daughter is assaulted by a gang of home invaders, Kersey's worldview is shattered. The police are overwhelmed and helpless. So, Kersey puts a handful of rolls of quarters into a sock, buys a revolver, and starts walking the darkest streets of New York, waiting to be mugged so he can execute his attackers. The film was a massive, controversial sensation. Audiences in crime-ridden cities literally stood up and cheered in the theaters when Kersey pulled the trigger. It is a raw, ugly, and undeniably powerful film that perfectly captures the paranoia and sheer terror of urban living in the 1970s. It stripped away all the romance of the vigilante, presenting Kersey's descent into violence as a grim, almost mechanical necessity. Number 13. Taxi Driver. Finally, we arrive at the absolute pinnacle of 1970s psychological cinema, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver from 1976. Written by Paul Schrader, the film stars Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle, a severely depressed, insomniac Vietnam veteran who drives a cab through the decaying, neon-lit streets of New York City. Travis is disgusted by the crime, prostitution, and filth he sees every night. He becomes obsessed with the idea that he is a righteous avenger, sent by God to wash the scum off the streets. Unlike Death Wish or Billy Jack, Taxi Driver does not ask you to cheer for the vigilante. It asks you to pity and fear him. Travis's descent into madness, culminating in his plan to assassinate a politician and his eventual bloody shootout in a brothel to save an underage prostitute, is a terrifying exploration of loneliness and delusion. Travis is the dark mirror of the vigilante archetype. He wants to be the hero of a Western movie, but he is fundamentally broken, a product of a society that has lost its moral center. The 1970s was a decade where the lines between hero and villain blurred beyond recognition. These 13 films took the rebellious, anti-establishment spirit that made Billy Jack a phenomenon and pushed it into every dark corner of the American landscape. They explored the psychology of people pushed to the edge, examining the heavy toll of taking the law into their own hands. Whether it was on a dusty Colorado farm, the swamps of Arkansas, or the blood-stained sidewalks of New York City, these movies proved that sometimes the only justice you get is the justice you make yourself. If you are a fan of uncompromising cinema, classic action, and stories that dare to challenge the rules, this is the era you need to explore.